So now I would like to introduce Stuart Buck. And again, Stuart, I don't have a bio that I'm reading, so I'll just kind of say, the things that I know about you, and feel free to fill in the blanks. So Stuart Buck worked as a VC for the Arnold Foundation, funding a lot of landmark open science initiatives, such as the Open Science Framework by Brian Nosek, and the Reproducibility Initiative by the Stanford professor Russ Poldrack. And more recently, he's been the director of the Good Science Project. The Good Science Project is funded by Patrick Collison from Stripe, Emergent Ventures again, and a couple of different nonprofits. And on a more personal note, the reason I invited Stuart is because two of my students, Nadia Blowstein and Aga Karakuzu, who couldn't be on the call now, but they're very happy and they'll watch the recording, went to the Meta Science conference that Stuart organized at the NIH. And basically, they were presenting our work there. And then they said, you really need to invite Stuart to come and talk to you. And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. And fortunately, Stuart agreed. So I can't wait to hear from you. And if there's anything I missed in the introduction, please let us know. Would be nice to hear your career path.
All right, sure. Yeah, that was a great introduction. You're quite right. I spent about 9 years in philanthropy, sponsoring a lot of work on open science and reproducibility, and then kind of struck out on my own, so to speak, a couple of years ago. But yeah, I've been excited to work in meta science for over 10 years now.
What brought you to meta science? I'm curious. What did you study before?
Well, I have a PhD that's actually in education policy. And it's really kind of a chance thing. I had a good friend who went to go work for what was then called the Arnold Foundation. Now it's called Arnold Ventures. They were just starting up. So Laura and John Arnold are a fairly young couple. They were like 38 at the time. And John Arnold made a lot of money running a hedge fund, and they retired at 38. And it's working around someone like that. You always feel like an underachiever. But yeah, they retired at 38 and decided to give away most of their wealth within their lifetime. So they set up a foundation, and they've been kind of running that full time ever since. And so, anyway, I had a good friend who went to work there. I had not heard of the Arnold Foundation before that because they, had just started up, but it sounded like a unique opportunity. And so yeah, I went there. And here's the interesting thing: they were not interested in meta science right at the first, but what they in fact wanted to do was promote evidence-based policy, meaning like in education or criminal justice or healthcare. The idea was like we want to fund programs or ideas that have strong, like overwhelming evidence behind them. And what they started to realize fairly quickly is that number one, in lots of areas, the research literature isn't all that clear on exactly, the top 3 ideas that are guaranteed to produce results, like in education or what have you. And then they also started to realize there were some articles about the replication problem in psychology that summer that I started in 2012. And they started to notice that, if there's this problem of replication and p-hacking and, publication bias, all these sorts of related issues, to the extent that's going on, then it's hard to know what the evidence even is in the first place. Like, should you trust the research literature in education or in criminal justice? Or are you just viewing results that have been p-hacked and, positively selected, via publication bias? So then they had this kind of, I guess, almost existential crisis and decided, okay, we need to put money into trying to help fix the problem of research inadequacy, publication bias, those types of issues. Just trying to improve the research and evidence process itself. So yeah, that's I guess a long story about how I came to end up focusing on that. And so yeah, I didn't plan it in advance, but I guess that's like a lot of science, actually. If you look at it, great historic scientists, like a lot of times they weren't planning their career or their discoveries in advance, because often, science takes you in unexpected directions. So anyway, let me figure out how to share my screen. And I've got a presentation here. Let's see. 1 second. Okay, I think you can see that.
Yep, I see it.
see, I think.
And Stuart, while you're getting ready and Matt's still on the call, Matt, would you be okay with this recording being shared? One with the students, two with the public, and both options are okay.
It's great with me. Stuart, just so you know, we can see your notes right now, so
Okay.
it's fine to share them. Yeah.
I don't have any notes, but I'm not even sure how to do
You're
this.
in like
Yeah,
how do I do this?
that should work. I mean, try to click that button with the cross screen. Yeah, try to do that.
This?
No, that's just gonna blank it out.
Oh,
I
no,
think it's
that didn't work.
fine. I think it's okay. We can see.
maybe try the display settings at the top.
Let me
Oh yeah.
see. Oh, this display,
Mhm.
swap presenter, slideshow. Maybe this will. How does that?
Great. Thank you, Matt.
Is that better? Good. I haven't actually done many PowerPoints on Zoom, and I guess it changes.
Lucky
Okay,
you.
so a very simple theme here: why we need more experiments in meta-science. So yeah, that's going to be the theme. So the problem here is that there are lots and lots of meta-science questions that are relatively untested. I mean, there are lots of ideas, maybe some kind of observational studies, but not any like really rigorous experiments that test these sorts of ideas. So and Matt has already talked about some of these himself. But so is it better to give more funding to the person, not the project? Or is it better to blind peer reviewers to the name and status of researchers? And it's interesting to me that those are two ideas that people will commonly mention, and they're polar opposites. One involves funding the person without regard to what research project they're working on, and the other involves funding a research project without regard to who's doing the research. So polar opposite ideas. Maybe they have different rationales, different goals. Like the goal of funding the person, not the project, might be to allow more flexibility and freedom and possible innovation. Maybe blinding peer reviewers is more fair and unbiased. And there's some evidences to that. But how do we choose between the two? Could we set up some sort of randomized trial that tries to measure all these various outcomes and tries to weigh them against each other? Another question, like, is it better to give 10-year grants as opposed to 3 to 4-year grants? And 10 is a number that I just picked, kind of randomly, but the point is to give longer term funding as opposed to shorter term funding. Because with the shorter term, I mean, science doesn't always operate on a yearly cycle. I mean, there are lots of research programs might take years to explore and to follow down paths that might turn out to be a blind alley. There's a famous paper that Pierre Azoulay and others wrote about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, comparing the Howard Hughes Medical Institute to NIH. And that paper is often cited to suggest that the Howard Hughes model of funding the person, not the project, is more successful than NIH along some metrics. But Pierre Azoulay told me once that perhaps one key difference is that Howard Hughes Medical Institute gives really long-term grants that are pretty sure to be renewed. And so that gives, and not worried that they have to churn out publications and already start writing the renewal grant application immediately. So he thought that might be a key factor. So that's something we could test over the long term. Okay, is it better to change peer review so that a single positive vote might get something funded? That's the golden ticket idea that Matt discussed earlier. That's something that I think there's some interest in testing that in NSF. It's an idea that we should test rigorously, but we should also be willing to test over the long term. That's a question I think. If it has an effect, it would probably take a long time to play out, precisely because of this practice that Matt mentioned, where a lot of times people will, or researchers will, essentially do a large component of a research proposal ahead of time, so that they can virtually promise success. If you switch the way in which you give approval to research proposals, it won't have an effect overnight, because a lot of people, people can't change their research direction overnight when they're already trying to get funding, that's kind of retroactive in a way. And then it might take time just for researchers to see if an agency is actually serious about funding innovative, outside the box proposals based on one peer review vote. So that's the kind of innovation that I am hopeful and is promising and should be rigorously tested, but it might take several years for researchers to start submitting, truly innovative applications because they now see the potential. Another question that I have is should we so-called red team scientific fields where the grants that are funded mostly seem to follow one particular perspective? And red teaming, I don't know if everyone is familiar with that term. It comes from defense or intelligence areas where basically the idea is that we're all susceptible to groupthink. And so if there's a common like strategy or approach that a group of people decides on, then to pressure test that, it's good to have a so-called red team. That's what the defense departments have called it, a red team, which it's a team of people whose sole job is to try to refute the strategy or their approach that everyone else is taking. And so this is a way of combating groupthink, because otherwise people, it's very hard to go against the crowd. It's very hard to like challenge your boss or to challenge your superiors and their opinions. So there are examples where, arguably, like, for example, in the Alzheimer's field, there's one theory, the amyloid theory of Alzheimer's, that, some researchers say has received too much attention and too much focus from funders. There are cases where researchers have told journalists on an anonymous basis that they've been told by NIH program officers to make sure that their research proposal talked about amyloid, even if it wasn't actually that wasn't what they preferred to study, but because that would be the thing that get funded. So my suggestion would be that maybe program officers or NIH, those types of institutes should figure out areas where it's possible that you're just funding one approach, one theory, and then assign a group of people to try to refute that. And maybe get more diversity of ideas, diversity of applicants. Again, that's something we could rigorously test. Would it be better to give program officers more discretion to overrule or even bypass peer review? Again, there's some reason to think that, for example, DARPA, the defense agency that is known to be so innovative here in the United States, their program officers often don't have to use peer review at all. They may use peer review at their choice, but it's really more up to them to try to figure out the most innovative projects to fund. So is that an approach that we should try more often throughout other agencies? It's a good question. We should test it. Is it better to fund one assistant professor, like say a new assistant professor, or to fund the 51st person to join a large lab? That's an untested question as far as I can tell. No one really knows. There are large biomedical labs that seem overall to be very productive. But if you add the 50th person, 51st person, is that as productive as giving that person funding to go out on their own and do their own thing? Who knows? What's the best method of scientific training and mentorship? There are lots of people who have ideas about this. There are lots of people who will complain that they did not get what they viewed as very good mentorship. It doesn't seem like something that's been systematically studied in the biomedical field. What would happen if we demanded that all scientific grants publicly report at least one failure or no result? Maybe that would encourage more risk-taking and or truth-telling, by which I mean the truth-telling versus p-hacking, publication bias, those types of incentives. How does the NIH intramural program, the 1,000+ scientists that work at NIH in-house, how does that compare to the extramural program? The intramural program, one of the possible benefits of that is that it's a little more fun, like funding the person, not the project. It's a group of people who have more employment security. They don't have to worry about raising their salary in soft money every year. So can we compare the results, and can we possibly randomize which how different funding, how different research topics are allocated between those? And then, you heard one of the studies that Matt Clancy discussed towards the end, where if peer reviewers discuss a proposal and one of them has a negative view, that can influence other people to be more negative as well. So what if you kept peer reviewers from talking to each other before voting independently? How would their overall votes change when they're actually, it's not just an experiment, but they're actually, making funding decisions? Anyway, there's a ton of questions like this where, there's some literature and you can point to various people who have different ideas and opinions. but I think we could do a lot better job of rigorously testing and experimenting more formally. So the idea is we need more experimentation in government. As of August 2023, this is now something in an official White House memo. There's a memo to federal agencies in the United States on submitting budgetary requests to Congress. And it said they should do, well, two things. I included two because I was interested in both. But one is federal agencies here should support the infrastructure and capacity for providing free, immediate, and equitable public access to federally funded research results while developing mechanisms to incentivize and reward open, reproducible, and secure research practices. So I think that's great. And the second one is about experimentation. Experiment with funding processes to better achieve agency R&D missions by designing, trying, and assessing new approaches, such as streamlining processes to minimize administrative burdens, engaging new R&D performers, exploring new R&D methods, and forging new partnerships. So that's a hopeful sign that the White House is instructing federal agencies to move in the direction of experimentation with R&D methods. It's also the recommendation of a kind of national report from Canada that came out a couple of years ago. Like one of their major recommendations was that we need to improve the evidence base for future national sciences and engineering funders, that we need more experimentation with alternative funding practices, along with data sharing and rigorous evaluation. And so here's the thing. This was a kind of international panel. It was chaired by Shirley Tillman, who was formerly the president of Princeton. And one of the things that the panel was trying to do was compare funding methods across different countries and across different places. And in the middle of this paragraph, you might notice it says, many funding practices seem promising, but are not substantiated by rigorous evaluations. When comparing different practices with common objectives, it is rarely possible to determine which is superior, and differences among jurisdictions complicated attempts to compare and transfer funding practices. So there at the end of the paragraph, by supporting experimentation with alternative funding practices and approaches, funding agencies can ensure that the evidence base continues to expand and improve over time, providing a clearer picture of the natural sciences and engineering funding practices most likely to succeed in any given context. Also from the UK, there's a place called the Research on Research Institute, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust. And they've been publishing this book called the Experimental Research Funders Handbook. So it's basically, as it says, a handbook on how research funders should try experimentation. And again, their motivation is that despite many challenges they face, research funders often fail to invest even tiny amounts in R&D activities to increase the impacts of their funding, and rarely systematically experiment with different ways to design and run their funding programs. As a result, research funders are missing out on opportunities to achieve their goals in a cost-effective way and to further accelerate the progress of science. Just to take a step back, I would just note how ironic, deeply ironic all of this is, because I think what many scientists would recognize in their own field is that you need some sort of rigorous testing and experimentation. You don't just like say something is true because an expert says so. You test it and experiment, and you try to design experiments so that they're well controlled, and so that you're not misled. And yet, when it comes to the actual funding of science, or the way we construct universities, the way we reward professors, the way we hire professors, the way grants are handed out, it's just deeply ironic that there's so little experimentation and rigor with regard to those questions. Instead, we all just do whatever experts think is the right thing to do, which doesn't necessarily make sense. So there is a precedent for this, and I wrote an article, or co-wrote an article about this in a journal last year, a journal called Health Affairs, that basically the title was something like "Learning Lessons from CMS." So CMS, if you don't know, it's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services in the United States. So it has a budget of well over $1 trillion, and it's responsible for funding Medicare, which is basically healthcare for elderly people in the United States, and Medicaid, which is healthcare for both poor people, and also it provides a lot of services to nursing homes and things like that. So it's an enormous healthcare program. Ironically, it's an interesting factoid to me that the United States spends more on Medicare and Medicaid per capita than most other countries do to provide health insurance to their entire population, not just to elderly people and poor people. So yeah, we spend a lot in America. We don't get much for it, but we spend a lot. About 12 years ago, with the Affordable Care Act, or sometimes called Obamacare, we established something called, well, it has different names, gone by different names. One was the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, or CMMI. More recently, it's been called the CMS Innovation Center. But it's a center at this Medicare and Medicaid Institute, where the whole point is to try to experiment with new ideas about how you pay doctors, or how you pay hospitals, or how you pay nursing homes, et cetera, and how you reward quality. So, there are lots of efforts in the U.S. to try to reward higher quality services, or try to penalize, low quality services. So for example, hospital performs an operation and lots of people end up coming back because of complications, within 30 days. CMS wants to penalize that sort of low quality service. So the idea is that, we spend a lot in America. We don't have a lot to show for it. So we need to find ways of cutting costs or improving quality, or both at the same time. So the point of this innovation center was to try to find new ways of experimenting with how healthcare is paid for and rewarded in the U.S. with the hopes of reducing costs, improving quality. So let's see, next slide. Right, so again, some quick facts. Again, as I mentioned, is created by the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And it was given a $1 billion budget per year for 10 years, which is a lot for research and experimentation. It's actually not a lot when you compare it to the overall, I think $1.5 trillion budget that Medicare and Medicaid have, but it's still a lot for research and evaluation. And so they launched 54 ideas in the first 10 years, encompassing almost 1 million doctors and 26 million patients nationwide, including some randomized trials. So I think this is a really interesting example of innovation and experimentation in government. So here's just a couple of examples of the kind of stuff that this agency has done. So one is what they call the Million Hearts Cardiovascular Risk Reduction Model. So they enrolled nearly 400,000 of a risk assessment tool for cardiovascular disease. Risk assessment, I mean, it's just like basically like a doctor is, making notes and ranking you on like how likely you are to be at risk and whether you need treatment like statin pills, et cetera. So the main results were that the treatment group had a 1.3 percentage point lower likelihood of heart attack or stroke and a 0.3 percentage point lower chance of death. So another one was called the Comprehensive Care for Joint Replacement Model. So the idea behind this is that a lot of people wear out their knees and or hips and they need a joint replacement. It's a kind of an optional surgery. It's not an emergency surgery that has to happen now or you die. Like it's something that can be scheduled in advance, and it's a very hopefully like kind of self-contained operation. If you're doing well, there shouldn't be a ton of complications, and you should be able to like schedule in advance, figure out how to pay for it, and then make sure there are no complications. Hopefully, so. They required 394 hospitals in 34 randomly selected metropolitan areas in the United States to participate in this specialized payment model for hip and knee replacements, where the hospital would agree to be responsible for follow-up services up to 90 days. So the idea was that if the hospital agreed to a certain payment and then to be responsible for follow-up services, now the hospital's incentivized, not to have complications, because the ironic incentive in America is that if you get paid every time someone goes to the hospital, there's almost an incentive to have more complications. Not that hospitals are directly trying to harm patients, but you make more money if there are more complications. So this is trying to combat that incentive and trying to say, no, you're not going to get paid more if there are more complications. That you the hospital are on the hook. So the cumulative savings were $72 million after 4 years, while the quality improved as the complications free. So that's useful. Now, some kind of lessons from this. There weren't any miracles, but even tiny percentage improvements if you think about millions of people and trillions of dollars, even very tiny percentage improvements are very important and can scale up nationally. But here's some also important lessons about what made this Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation successful. One is that it had immense latitude or authority to experiment. So it was given a budget of, as I said, $1 billion a year for 10 years. That's pretty extraordinary in the U.S. Like normally, federal agencies, have to, ask for a budget every single year. They don't get a 10-year allocation. So that was important because it gave this agency the freedom. And, I think, as I said, scientists sometimes perhaps need the freedom to think about a 10-year time frame. Federal agencies maybe sometimes need the freedom to think about a 10-year time frame because they're undertaking these large experiments that might take several years to pay off. You don't want everything to get canceled in a year or two because the politicians have gotten impatient. So you want to think about long-term time frame. Another is that the agency had the authority to waive statutory requirements that otherwise would have prevented new experiments or pilots. So Medicare and Medicaid in the U.S. are subject to lots and lots of regulations and statutory requirements. And if you want to experiment with new approaches, sometimes you need to have the freedom just to move forward. And then finally, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation has the ability to scale up findings as to programs that work. So the idea is that, if you find a solid, reduction in expenses or improvement in quality or both, then you should take that finding from a smaller experiment and try to scale it up nationwide. So I think there are a lot of lessons there for at agencies like each or the NSF or the equivalent in other countries. I think they should have a Center for Innovation and Experimentation. And like CMMI, it should have long-term funding that's insulated from political pressure. So again, you need time to execute some of these projects. Like I mentioned, Golden Ticket, like you would want to be able to try that experiment, I think, for several years before you start to see results. And even then, when you start to see results, like the results might be seen over a several-year time frame. So, we have to really be willing to be patient about meta-science experiments and try new ideas that might take 10 years to actually see whether something works. And that's really difficult for politicians to do a lot of times, but I think it's important. I mean, 10 years are going to go by whether or not we experiment or not. So we might as well try new ideas, and then at least 10 years from now we'll have learned something rather than just doing things the same old way for 10 years. Second, like CMMI, a Center for Innovation and Experimentation should be given authority to waive statutory and regulatory requirements. So for example, in the US, there's a federal law that says NIH can only fund projects if it got approval by at least 50% of peer reviewers. So if you want to experiment with a golden ticket model at NIH, you have that federal law standing in the way. And so you would need to have the ability to, give an exemption to that federal law. And that, by the way, I think is the reason why NSF in the United States is interested in experimenting with the golden ticket model, but not NIH so far. NIH can't do that right now. NSF can. There's no federal laws to NSF that says they can only fund projects with an approval of 50% of peer reviewers. And then third, I think is important that a Center for Innovation should have the ability to strongly incentivize, maybe through extra funding, or even require participation in experiments. Because, if everything's voluntary, then I think there are a lot of agencies, like NIH, that are very decentralized in terms of authority and budget. So NIH in the United States, there are 27 different institutes and centers, and there's the Office of the Director. They're all run fairly independently. They usually have their own budget from Congress, and so it can be difficult. And I've heard this from people who worked at NIH, directly reporting to Francis Collins. It can be difficult to do NIH-wide initiatives, when all you can do is basically try to persuade people to go along with it. And so I think a lot of experiments that we can imagine in terms of meta science, you would need the ability to, kind of almost force, certain people at NIH to participate, because if they could all opt out, then maybe you don't have an experiment anymore. Now, I've talked a lot about the wonders, the wondrous powers of experiments and why experiments are awesome. But I do think there are a lot of possible pitfalls with experiments and want to be sure to mention those. So one is that we shouldn't get too fixated on short-term metrics. Now, here's the problem I have with a lot of kind of meta science is that we look at uh, metrics like citations or whether articles got published in so-called top journals, which how is it a top journal? Because it gets cited a lot, so that's back to citations. I'd argue that just citations are not quite right. So there's some evidence, and I cite a paper there. I can forward you the whole paper if you want. But a lot of novel papers aren't highly cited right at first. Like they may get highly cited, a decade from now, but they may not be highly cited right at first. And that's not surprising. Like if you think about it, a lot of scientific breakthroughs may not be fully appreciated or understood or agreed with at the time. I mean, you can easily think of examples where some great scientific breakthroughs were like, hated at the time. Like the Semmelweis who came up with the germ theory of disease. Like other doctors hated him because he was suggesting that like you might be killing your patients by spreading germs from one to the other. And so, very unpopular. I think the person who came up with the theory of continental drift, that also was a very unpopular theory at the time. So, sometimes true breakthrough ideas are going to be unpopular at first. And so like we can't get caught up with like short-term metrics. And another example I think would be like, there are a number of studies, and Matt talked about some of these, that try to look at whether grant peer review works, so to speak. And the definition of whether something works is whether it predicts future citations. But to me, that can almost become a little bit circular because, grant peer review at the NIH, at least, you've got 20 or 30 people who are, peers in a scientific field, often a very narrow scientific field, deciding whether a grant is worth funding. And so it's kind of not surprising to me that like if they like a particular idea, they might also be the type of people who would cite that idea later on. So in a way, it's not perfectly circular, but it's a little bit circular. That like ideas that get highly cited and that also get a lot of funding are ideas that are currently popular in a given field. So you would kind of expect, positive peer review ratings and citations to be correlated, at least in the short term. But I think there are a lot of scientific breakthroughs, as I mentioned, that are unpopular at first or that actually develop over one or more decades. So I think we should probably consider how to design shorter term metrics that might be correlated with longer term outcomes, hopefully. So for example, we could look at the proportion of grants going to younger investigators. That's something that you could easily determine in the shorter term. It's not perfectly predictive at all necessarily of great science or scientific breakthroughs, but there is some reason to think that our system today, at least in the US, I can't speak for Canada, but at least in the US, it's kind of biased against younger investigators. You may have seen, I should have included this. There's a famous chart of like the age, the proportion of NIH grants that go to people under 35 versus people over 65, past retirement age. And so in the past 40 years, let me see if I can do this so it comes across right. So yeah, the proportion of grants going to people over retirement age has gone up tenfold. And on the same chart, the proportion of grants going to people under 35 has plummeted more than tenfold. So what we're seeing, I mean, partly what we're seeing there is just the aging of the scientific population, aging of the baby boomers, I suppose. But there are lots of examples of people that have done great scientific work, even Nobel-winning work in their mid-20s. And it's kind of daunting today if you're in your mid-20s, right? That you're not getting a major NIH grant. You're barely through a PhD, perhaps, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that being willing to fund younger investigators with good ideas could be a way of like opening up the scientific funding system to those brilliant ideas without making them continue to slave away for another 10, 15 years before they're eligible basically for their first major grant. Another outcome might be the rate at which preclinical research gets turned into phase 1 trials in humans. That again is something that is a little more applied. I mean, it doesn't necessarily work for lots of areas of research, but any area of research that is supposedly going to lead to drug discovery and so forth, we should be considering like how successful and how often does that actually lead to like an initial trial of something in humans. Another is we could look at the failure rate of purportedly high-risk projects. So it's kind of interesting. There are a lot of people and government funders will talk about high-risk, high-reward research, and they'll announce some programs to fund that. But then they'll brag about the success rate of all the wonderful stuff they funded. And to me, that's kind of a contradiction in terms. Like if you're actually funding high-risk research, then you should be bragging that 90% of the stuff you funded failed. If that wasn't the case, then it wasn't really high risk in the first place. And then another to go into even more pitfalls. Yeah, maybe what we care most about are true outliers, like the discovery of penicillin or the invention of the internet. Maybe that's what we would like to be able to maximize, right? Imagine if you have something like that happen once every 5 years rather than once every 10 years. That could make a huge impact on the world, right? But the problem is that experimentation may be much better at detecting small average improvements on measurable metrics than at detecting once in a generation outliers. So that's kind of a I guess fundamental challenge for experimentation. It may be tough to experimentally detect some of the things that might be the most high impact. On the other hand, again, maybe there are some shorter term measurable metrics that could increase our chance of getting outliers, even if we have to wait a generation to see them. So I mentioned bureaucracy. In the U.S., there are federally funded surveys of scientists that get funding from the government and that ask them how they spend their time. And the most recent survey came out in 2018. There's another one in progress right now, but 2018, scientists said that they spend about 44% of their time on administration, bureaucracy, compliance, paperwork, all that sort of stuff. That's pretty depressing if you think about it. Like that nearly half of the money that we're paying scientists in the U.S. may be kind of spent on complying with our own grant paperwork requirements. But then I think, well, maybe instead of thinking about, how can we improve the percentage of outliers, which may be hard to detect, maybe we can think of and phrase the question inversely, like, how can we stop doing things that probably inhibit outliers? And so it seems to me that, like, if you look at any area of top human performance, whether it's athletics, sports, like if you went to the top soccer players or the top track and field athletes or the top basketball players and said, look, half the time that you would like to spend on your sport, practicing or teamwork or reviewing tapes of a game so that you can prepare, we're going to actually make you spend half of that time filling out paperwork. But it seems to me it'd be pretty obvious that would keep some of the top athletes from actually being the best at what they do. Now, maybe it would inhibit everybody equally, but it seems to me obvious that, like, if you have a top performer in a given field and you say, look, hey, we want you to spend 50% of your time on paperwork, that's probably going to harm their performance. And so I think if we can find things that we're doing that probably harm people's performance, and we can stop doing those things, then that might overall improve the rate at which true scientific outliers and breakthroughs happen, even if it might be hard to experimentally detect that, once every 10, 20 years. So anyway, the moral of all this is that we do need to experiment more. We need to be very thoughtful about how we measure the results of experiments, and we need to be willing to wait for long-term results to see how it all works out. So that's basically my presentation.
So I'm not sure if Stuart is frozen or if my connection is bad. Stuart is frozen.
He froze for me too.
Yeah, we don't listen to him.
So
Oh, is it
Stuart,
still
not sure if you
present?
can hear us. You froze kind of when you said the moral.
Ah,
So I
well,
know it's talking since.
just the moral is that we need to, we do need to do more experiments, many more experiments with scientific funding. But at the same time, we need to be very patient and we need to be very thoughtful about how we measure the outcomes. And because I worry it could be the worst of all worlds if we did a bunch of short-term experiments and then said, oh wow, we didn't increase citations over the next year, and then we stopped doing something that actually would have been really useful. So I think we need to be very thoughtful about it, but yeah, continue to do more experiments.
Great. Thank you very much. That really kind of segued well from where Matt left off. So I think we have a very complete picture of the issues that we're facing with science policy and science funding. Uh,
Yeah,
what I would
thank you.
like is,
And I'm looking
yeah, go ahead.
and I'm
Sorry.
looking at the chat, and thank you so much for like supplying citations. And I noticed you found the exact chart that I was trying to describe with my hands there. So that's great.
Uh, so, I mean, you didn't hear this part because we started when Matt joined, but basically, this course is really kind of a sandbox for me, something to have fun with. So every year I do something different. It's about emerging biomedical technologies, but this semester I decided to do a cycle on meta science. And many of the people on the call are students starting their graduate degrees. There's
Mhm.
also some people that have joined from different communities and mailing lists that I'm a part of. But it's I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes just kind of getting the students to ask questions. And they did ask questions on a separate app. It's called Slido, so I know them. But the one thing they didn't do is they didn't upvote the questions. So
Huh.
try to do that. I'm curious which questions you're most curious about, or just raise a hand and ask a question of Stuart.
Am I supposed to be able to see Slido, whatever that is,
Well, you
or no?
could if you want to. I really didn't want to
Okay.
burden you with it, just because it just asks an additional effort.
Oh, perfect.
But
Well, that's fine. I just didn't want to be missing something that I was
no,
supposed
no,
to
no,
look
it's
at.
fine.
So,
Basically,
okay.
there's been about 20 questions while you were talking, and I can
Ah,
start asking them. But if you want to see them, there you just go here in the chat. There's slide.do, and then you enter that code that's right below it. And I'll start with some questions that I find interesting while people try to upvote and we see what they find interesting. Somebody asked about the parallels between VC funding and science funding, how similar it is. And then you're kind of at the intersection doing VC science funding. So, or were. So can you expand a little bit on that?
well, yeah, I think the one most accurate parallel would be between VC funding and again what people call high risk, high reward research. I think the ideal of a venture capitalist would be that you're funding ideas that may or may not work, and on the ones that don't work, you end up like with losing your investment. But that means that the ones that do work, you're hoping they pay off, many-fold, maybe tenfold, 100-fold, and that more than makes up for the other, the other investments that didn't work out. And so the idea is that like that's what makes a venture capital unique. That's why it's different from just being a kind of standard investor or being just like a bank that's investing in bonds that are very safe. Like there's a trade-off in finance between risk and reward. So if you want a guaranteed 3% return, like maybe you can find or 5% return, you can find that somewhere, and you're not going to lose a ton of money, but you're also not going to have an investment that turns out to make $1 billion. Um, but conversely, if you want to have the possibility of hugely impactful, highly rewarding investments, that's but going to be riskier, and so there are going to be a lot of ones that fail, and then a few that succeed. And so what's difficult for me to see is like how that has actually played out in science funding, because as I hinted at, like there are uh, a bunch of high risk, high reward research programs and I don't see so far places where funders are saying, "Yep, 90% of what we did failed, but the 10th one was a new penicillin or some equivalent." Right? I don't see that sort of model. I mean, it's more again, it's much more common, like if you look at the reports or the websites of these programs, for them to talk about all the nice successes they've had. And they don't look like enormously impactful scientific breakthroughs, and they don't look like mostly failures. They look like some pretty decent science. And that seems to me like, well, that's fine. You know, science funders want to fund, you know, pretty decent science. That seems fine. I think that's great, but that's not actually high risk and high reward. So yeah, I'm a little like puzzled at. I mean, I could go on a rant about like why we shouldn't be talking about high risk, high reward at all in the first place. It's just like, because a lot of high reward stuff in science is hard to predict ahead of time, or hard to even identify. Sometimes it's accidental, serendipitous. As I mentioned, sometimes it's unpopular at first. And so yeah, I mean, it's a difficult area.
I think part of the problem, again, just expanding on this, is I would say the reward is less well defined in science funding. You know, like in VC, it's kind of like, well, you know, do you have an IPO? Do you make money in the short term or in the long term? In science, it's more kind of these metrics that are nebulous, you know, like you're talking about citations. But even
Right.
citations are really just kind of, I'll just put the name of the paper I remembered. They're not really insightful. They don't tell you, oh, somebody really used something from this paper, and that's why they're citing it. So it's more kind of like monopoly money we're working with on several levels, you know?
Right.
The high risk, high reward is easier to define when it's just money.
Exactly. In fact, I wrote a piece about this once with regard to philanthropy in general, not science, but um, just that when you're a VC, you know, if you invest $10 million in 10 different companies and you've invested $100 million, and if 9 of them fail, but the 10th one turns out to produce $1 billion, okay, you've got $1 billion payoff, 100 million investment, so you know you've you made 10 times your money. And it's very easy to see, like the money that you made more than compensates for the losses that you incurred, because it's all money. Like you can write an equation, or you can, you know, have a balance sheet, and like the money in is more than the money out, and so you're happy about that. Citations aren't exactly the same thing as money. Like it's not like, you know, if I'm a funder and I fund something that gets cited 1,000 times, and then I fund 9 projects that don't get cited at all, like it's not like the citation. I don't know. The citations don't seem like the same kind of metric where like they literally balance off and pay off the citations that didn't happen. Like I don't know. It's just a different way of thinking about it. And then, um, yeah, I mean, as a philanthropist, I mean, if you fund 9 projects that fail, it's kind of internally painful. It's cognitively difficult to bear that, but you know, to think, wow, I'm just pouring money down the drain because I'm a philanthropist, and like I don't make money on any of this. So like the most that happens is if I fund something that works as a philanthropist, I get to be happy about it, right? And maybe some people compliment me, but it's not like the happiness or the compliments pay off the 9 times where I feel like, oh man, I failed. Like it doesn't really balance the same way that money does. So yeah, it's a kind of difficult. Just as if you're a funder yourself, it's difficult to trade off, you know, compliments and happiness and personal reward versus personal feelings of failure. Like it's
Yeah, fair enough.
not quite the
Agreed.
same balance.
So people started upvoting, and the most popular post is that Little Sims is coming to Montreal. I think that's a band. I don't know who they are, but I ask students to give me recommendations. Nothing
Okay.
to do with our talk, but you know, it's just something to get us talking. And then the second most upvoted is by Alberto, who says, "What's your top priority in meta science research to enhance the practice of science and its methodologies? And you know, which subjects do you think should have priority?" I guess he means biology versus medicine versus
Hmm.
computer.
Wow, that's a great question in terms of which subjects should have priority. I mean, yeah, I think they face different issues. So like when you come to like clinical trials in medicine, like to me, that's an area where talking about innovation is a little more scary. Like by the time you're testing a drug in human beings, like hopefully you've done all the lab work and the, you know, the pharmaceutical, you know, pharmacokinetics, and you've done the animal testing to the extent that's necessary, and so forth. And but by the time you're giving it to humans, you should be very sure that there's some possibility that this is going to work, and that it's not going to like make the humans drop dead or something. I mean, there actually are some tragic cases where like a drug, when first tested in humans, you know, sent, killed people or sent them to straight to the hospital. Like it worked in mice, but not in humans. So yeah, I mean, by the time it gets to clinical trials in humans, like I don't think that's the time when you want a bunch of improvisation and creativity and thinking outside the box and then having people making it up as they go along. Like you for safety and ethical reasons, you want to be very tightly controlled at that point. Whereas the earlier stage, basic science, I think those are places where you don't necessarily need to have everything like perfect in advance. Like you should have a lot more flexibility and freedom, because again, so a lot of the great discoveries, whether it's PCR testing or whether it's CRISPR, that they have happened almost accidentally. They've come from places no one expected. That like maybe what the National Institutes of Health need is another institute called the National Institute of Obscure Bacteria, because so many great discoveries in biomedicine have come from somebody just like poking around at some obscure I mean, that's literally where CRISPR came from. Somebody poking around obscure bacteria and saying, "Oh, this is an interesting sequence in their genetic code," and no one thought it was relevant to human health at all at first. And that type of story is how a lot of great scientific breakthroughs end up coming about. And so I do think in those areas we need more freedom for people to just explore their curiosity. So yeah, what I think, the first part of the question was like, what's the top priority? I mean, I think one top priority for me would just be, and I think I mentioned this on the first slide, like trying to incentivize people to talk about failures and null results. Because I think that's what often goes missing in science, that everyone knows that you fail a lot, that there are things you try that don't work. But then they all get swept under the rug, and the only thing that gets published is like, I finally had this great success. I feel like we're missing, 90% of how that success came about. And so we're missing a lot of information. And if it's only the great successes that get published, that's incentivizing people to sometimes commit outright fraud. Like there are quite a few cases, more and more, where like supposedly top scientific publications turn out to be literally fraudulent, based on fraudulent data, fraudulent images, etc. And I think that is probably a direct result of the fact that people are incentivized to get both grants and publications by saying, "I discovered this amazing effect or this amazing thing that happened," rather than incentivizing people to say, just to tell the truth. What did you do? Were the results complicated, messy, a failure? If it was a question worth studying in the first place, it's a question where we should know the answer. So that's kind of the biggest picture question that I think we ought to be thinking about in metascience, is how to incentivize people, meaning researchers, publications, funders, to be more open about failures and no results, because that would free up more people to be able to tell the truth rather than being incentivized to commit fraud or to p-hack or to hide the no results, etc.
So I'll improvise on top of this, because I think it hits something that's very near and dear to me, which is it comes down to provenance. It comes down to, can we actually somehow relate this money that comes from government or other funders to the research that's being done, to the publications that are being published, but actually go to for-profit publishers that couldn't care less as long as you give them the money. So all of a sudden, it's really hard to kind of draw this straight line to say, oh, like the line from my money to, what actually came out is a clear line that shows the real benefit. In reality, all of that gets obscured. At each level, there's an additional level of noise being added. And I think trying to do provenance the right way, where you have an unsuccessful experiment, but you're mandated to report it as part of your grant, because that's what you set out to do. And then your accidental findings, your bacteria lying somewhere, well, that also goes in a publication, but you say, well, it wasn't really my idea originally, but this is what came out of it. This is something that's truly missing for us to be able to trace the evolution of the idea and not to just cherry pick and p-hack, which is what we're doing.
Yeah. And no, I think I don't have much to add. I think that was very well said. I think you're right. Tracing the provenance between funding and ideas, is difficult. I mean, it's often difficult. I mean, I was a funder. It's very difficult sometimes even to figure out which papers like are related to the grant that you funded at all. Like, because I mean, here's the thing, like the publication pipeline often takes years. I mean, so there were occasions when I worked at Arnold where I would literally more than one occasion where I would read about a paper on Twitter and I would think, oh wow, that sounds really interesting. That's relevant to some of the stuff we're doing at Arnold. And then I would look it up and I would see that we funded it. In fact, it came from a grant from 6 years before. The grant ended 3 years ago, but the researcher kept working with the data, and it took a long time to get through peer review, and it maybe got rejected. And by the time it appears in print, it's another 3 years later, and no one at Arnold had any idea that this publication was out, except that I randomly found it on Twitter. And so I feel like that's probably happening all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. So curious, are you familiar with Balaji Srinivasan?
Yes, the former Coinbase guy, and he's written a book on the network state.
Yeah, the CTO of Coinbase. So, yeah. So basically, Balaji and I were roommates back in the day during an undergrad
Really?
at Stanford.
Wow.
And we had discussions about this a lot. And he actually, in the network state, talks about this need for putting things on chain. He's really somebody who says everything should be on chain, sometimes to an extreme. But I think scientific papers that talk to other scientific papers or talk to the original grants from which they originated is something that's really necessary. And you get the data, you cite the paper, not because you like the paper, but because you actually use the data in that paper, or you cite the formula because everything is there in a living document that is not just a PDF. I think that idea, it's really Balaji's idea, is something that could really drive forward that line so that I know exactly where things are coming from. And anyway, it's interesting that we came down to this, but the more I think about it, the more I think it makes sense.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I'd love to see how that would be implemented, and how you get people to participate across all of science.
So let's see what else. Well, we have another very upvoted comment, which is that Hacksaw Ridge is a recommendation for a movie. Good, thank you. I've seen it. I like it. And Alyssa asked about reducing paperwork. So basically, scientists are spending more time doing paperwork than actual research. How can we reduce the paperwork?
Well, this is a really difficult question. I mean, it's one that I've written some about, and so here's the basic problem is one that kind of goes to this issue called public choice theory, which is that it's this idea that when government dollars are being spent, oftentimes there's a very kind of small group of people, often maybe a special interest group, that's getting the benefit of those dollars. And so they have a huge incentive to lobby for those dollars being spent to benefit themselves. But if this expenditure costs everyone across the country maybe $1 per person, no one has the incentive to go, fund a huge lobbying effort against that spending of $1. Like, I'm not going to go spend, $500,000 lobbying to prevent my tax going up by $1, right? So no one has the incentive to lobby against it. And so you can end up with special interest groups like kind of distorting the process that way. And so I think that ironically that the spread of bureaucracy can kind of have the same sort of phenomenon going on. So, for example, there's multiple executive orders in the United States, one of which says that if you receive federal money, you have to wear seatbelts when you're in a car. Like if you're driving a car related to whatever you're doing, you have to wear seatbelts and certify that you have a program to make people wear seatbelts. Now there is and that was from 1997. There's another order from 2009 that said you have to make sure people aren't texting while driving, because texting while driving is dangerous. And so you can keep listing like all of these examples of like where people have to get federal money in the United States have to check a box that they're doing this. And so here's the thing, like that one little imposition, check a box that people aren't texting while driving, that's not a huge imposition in and of itself, right? It's just checking a box. And conversely, like there's no like huge lobbying effort to say let's get rid of this check the box, let's be in favor of texting while driving. Like that's not what anyone wants to lobby about. And meanwhile, there's probably like a handful of people whose job it is at NIH to go through and make sure every university, every researcher has checked all the right boxes. And so that's a small group of people that has an intense interest, because it's their job, of saying, look, we're making universities do the right thing, and we're trying to make sure that people are safe and that people do the right thing. And so, but you put all that together over like 1,000 different paperwork type requirements, and the burden is like extraordinary for individual researchers. But if you dig in and look at any one specific paperwork burden, like there's going to be like somebody that says, no, there's a great reason for that, we need that, that's an important check, that's an important way of making sure that somebody does the right thing. And there's not going to be a powerful lobby that says, no, we want the power to do the wrong thing in that case. So you've got this kind of imbalance and this structural imbalance between like anybody that wants to add more paperwork, they can say, look, it's the burden is going to be 1 minute per person, and this is really important for us to look into. And then you build out all that up 1,000 times over, and it's taking up 40 to 50% of people's time. So that's the kind of inherent political challenge. Like, so if I want to go in and like say, hey, we should get rid of these executive orders, like that's just a really difficult political thing to do, right? Because who's like against seatbelts, who's in favor of texting while driving, or a million other things that were. And so I think you just need to have some independent committee that has the power to go through all of these requirements wherever they come from and say, look, we can't make researchers do 1,000 different things. They all might be good ideas, but it's just too much. So we have to prioritize. We have to figure out what's actually important to make sure that we're spending federal dollars effectively, and we're not letting people commit fraud, and we're not letting people abuse the money and so forth. What are the top 3 things that we should be doing, or the top 10, not the top 1,000, right? So we have to prioritize, and we have to be willing to make difficult choices and cut things, cut requirements, even if there's somebody who says, well, that's a good idea by itself. Yes, it will be a good idea by itself, but it's not just by itself. It's with 1,000 other things. And so you need to have the ability to prioritize and make some serious cuts.
Thank you. So let's go with the 3 more questions that have been upvoted here. The first one should be short. It's just a clarification for Nika. So basically, she wants to know, what does it mean when it says the federal law requires 50% of peer reviewers' approval? That's for NIH concretely. So maybe you can explain what that means, Stuart.
That's a good question, because the federal law is not actually all that clear. I mean, what I gave you is pretty much a quote, direct quote, that 50% of peer reviewers have to approve it. But the way NIH runs peer review, it's not like they vote yes or no on.
I need to clarify here. Again, Nika, here we're talking about peer review of grants, not peer review of publications, because your follow-up question is the article and how do you select the article. It's about grants that actually ask for funding. That's the kind of peer review we're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's let me see. Let me look this up real quick.
Yeah. I'll guess while Stuart looks up. My feeling is that they look at the scores, and they will never fund a grant that scored below 50% by any reviewer. So basically, they're just kind of removing any grants that at least one reviewer doesn't like. That's my impression, but Stuart, correct me if that's wrong.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So it's the opposite of a golden ticket, really. Like golden ticket says, one reviewer likes it, go. This is one reviewer hates it, no way you're getting it. I guess that's one way to interpret it.
Yeah, okay. So I found the actual law. Here is the direct quote from the law. And I could send a link to that if anyone's curious. It's like it literally says, the secretary, that means the secretary of HHS, which is the agency that's actually over NIH. So saying the secretary may not approve or fund any project subject to technical and scientific peer review, that's what we're talking about, peer review, unless the proposal has undergone such review and has been recommended for approval by a majority of the members of entity conducting such review. So again, it's not exactly clear in the law what that means, because again, like my understanding of study sections at NIH is not that they all say, all right, thumbs up, thumbs down, all right, 50% of us said thumbs up, or 51%, so therefore we're going to pass. I mean, they're more like rating grants between 1 to 5 or 1 to 9, and then the agency goes through and makes a percentile ranking of that. And so yeah, it's one of these issues where like the law says something and NIH does things a different way, but so it's not totally clear. But I mean, here's the thing, like with the funding being as tight as it is, where like only 10 to 20% of grants are getting funded, I think NIH can probably guarantee you that like a majority of the people in peer review would have said fund this grant, and because the majority of people in peer review probably would have said fund a lot more than what ended up getting funded. So,
All right, thank you very much. Next, just a second. It's a question by Moritz. In the last talk, we heard that we often need around 20 years to see the results of research. That's what Matt talked about. How can we evaluate the results of the proposed experiments earlier? We mentioned citations, but what other ways of really seeing immediate impact?
yeah, I mean, I offered a few suggestions, but those are just suggestions that maybe there are some cases where we can like kind of predict what's likely to lead to longer term outcomes. So again, one of them might be funding more people that are under the age of 30. Like that might be something NIH should try to do, and you could measure that immediately. And then, it's hard to guarantee what would happen after 10, 20 years, but you can look at history, you can see like, James Watson, when he like was on the paper about the structure of DNA in 1953, I think he was like 25 years old. Einstein, like his biggest year, 1905, he was 25 years old. There are multiple
Neither
cases.
of them were peer reviewed, by the way. Like that's the other thing.
Right. Yeah.
The DNA paper was not peer reviewed. Einstein's early work was not peer reviewed.
Oh yeah, the one time that Einstein submitted a paper to physical review and it's got sent out for peer review, he was outraged about it. He sent this indignant letter to the journal editor saying, "I didn't authorize you to send out my work," and he refused to publish after that. So,
it turns out he was wrong actually, but yeah, I showed this example last week, so the students saw it.
Great, you know it then. But yeah, I mean, there's so many examples of people that have been able to do great work in their mid-20s, or sometimes even before. Newton discovered calculus when he was like 22. Like, of course, you can't discover calculus a second time, but I mean, there are people who are like brilliant and who can make great discoveries at a young age. And when you look at the NIH, and the average age of the first grant is like the first major grant is like 42 to 44 years old.
But sorry,
that
there's a delay, so I'm cutting into you. But there is a direct connection here between 20-year-old nobody knows, but there is some kind of merit to the idea, and 40-year-old has some status and now gets funded. And I think that that line that you're showing is probably also illustrating this kind of reliance on authority and status more than on the originality of the idea, because it's difficult to evaluate the idea.
Yeah. So yeah, but I mean, I think to the extent that we think, okay, from just judging from history, there have been people who have made great discoveries in their 20s. Great discoveries are not limited to people in their 40s and above. Then if we're almost systematically ruling out people in their 20s from getting major NIH grants, then we're probably ruling out some possible breakthroughs, or we're making people jump through so many hoops that maybe they go off and they do something else with their lives instead. Like and this is just an anecdote, but I recently met this biology professor at I'd say top 20 university. He was 40 years old. It was his first real job, so to speak. He'd spent 8 years doing postdocs. He was married, but his wife lived across the country, 3,000 miles away, because she would do academic jobs and they couldn't live in the same place or get a job at the same place. And he told me that he probably spent 70% because he did animal experiments, and his university, like his administrators, had switched over. Like he had to do it all himself. He felt like he said there's no time to do science anymore. And then just on a personal level, he said that like of all the people he knew in his PhD and postdoc cohort, that half of them were already divorced, and like only one of them had children. And I thought, okay, if you told like a really smart 21-year-old, okay, you could be 40 years old, 40 by the time you get your first real job and stop having to do low-paid postdocs around the lucky enough to be married at all, your spouse might live on 3,000 miles away from you, and you won't even have time to do science anymore. That sounds like an utterly miserable process. That's a terrible career choice. So I worry that by the bureaucracy and by the career timelines, that we're probably driving a lot of people out of biomedical science altogether. Like that's just not an appealing job, or maybe people go into it because they don't realize that's what might happen. But again, I think it's a serious issue. It's not just purely academic.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. So we'll wrap up with the last question asked by Jane 10 minutes ago and already the most upvoted. How would one encourage scientists to publish negative results?
I mean, number one, I think journals should emphatically state that they are willing to publish, consider and publish null results, and they should follow through on that. Funders like NIH could demand, to see what have been the null results or the failures that you've experienced. Like there shouldn't be any such thing as a scientific project that can last 4 or 5 years and is 100% successful. If it's 100% successful, then I mean, the only way I can see that genuinely happening in science, is if you're doing like, high school level chemistry experiments where like you combine this chemical with that chemical and it gets this reaction, which we know because it's been done a million times. Like that's the only place where you should expect 100% like success in science, is if you're doing something like that. But if you're actually doing like new work that merits funding, from the NIH or from NSF, there should be at least some possibility of failure. It shouldn't be 100% success. That seems impossible. So tell us about the things you tried that didn't work. Like funders could demand that. They could say, look, don't just come back and tell us this rosy story about how everything is perfect. Like, tell us what didn't work. Tell us what failed. Because that really ought to be happening, unless you're faking the results, or unless you're doing something that's really basic. So
perfect. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just ask something?
Yeah, Jane, you asked the question originally, so go ahead.
Yeah, so are there any cases in which anyone asks for people to provide all of the backup, not data, but like how many times the experiment was done, or the negative data or something? Are there any cases in which they're asked to do this?
I don't know if there are any cases, but you could imagine like saying provide your copies of your lab notebooks, like or some equivalent. Like give us a kind of history of an experiment or a set of experiments and how that actually played out. I mean, I think that would be an example of what I think that could be useful.
Clinical trials are probably the most regulated in this respect, because you have to pre-register what you're going to do, and then you really have to show the results. So yeah, you could be faking the data, but there's no way to hide the data, keep it in the file drawer, which is what happens with other research.
Okay, but if you repeat the experiment like 10 times and only 1 time out of 10 it worked, do you have to provide the 9 other times, or do you, even in clinical?
No, in clinical trials you have to, because every time you register it, you register the trial, and then you say exactly what you're going to do. So if you say I'm re-registering the trial, that's already a red mark. But in regular research, there's no way for anybody to know. Often people will do the experiment and then they will hypothesize after the experiment. So they will come up with it's called harking. It's basically hypothesizing after the results are known. And there's just no way to report that. It's really difficult to catch it.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
All right. Well, this has been a really informative and well-discussed presentation. I'm really grateful for all the questions that you asked. And Stuart, a couple of questions for you. One, is it okay to share this recording with the students? Because they will use this as inspiration for their meta-science projects. They will have a meta-science deliverable in 3 weeks. Second, are you okay with us sharing this online? Or would you rather keep it in a
I'm fine. I mean, as best as I recall, it sounded somewhat coherent, so that's fine.
It did. Thank you very much. And finally, maybe we can all take a photo. Again, each student is assigned a week in which they're tweeting about this course, and we're going to start in a couple of days. So, maybe we can have a document. Whoever wants to be in the photo, turn on your cams. If you don't want to be in the photo, you can turn it off too. It's fine. So let's do 1, 2, 3. All right. Excellent. And again, we'll see whether we tweet about it. I'll share the photo. If you're not comfortable with it being shown anywhere, that's also fine. Just let us know. So there's the photo. And Stuart, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time you took, the discussion, and maybe you do another meta science conference soon and we see each other there.
All right, great. Thanks so much.